Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 7, and in this lesson, we're going to be covering another mini project, this one for WPF. So let's look at the homework, which looks identical to the homework for the WinForm project, for a good reason. It's the exact same thing, it's just now we're going to do it in WPF. So the homework is to build a WPF application, WPF.core, with two forms. Create a form that takes in a person's information, and another that takes in the address information. And that address can be multiple per person. Remember to bring it back to that first form in a list box or something similar. Now, some of the techniques you learned in the WinForm homework will apply to this WPF application, but make sure that you make this more flexible like a WPF application should be. Don't just drag and drop. Okay? So go ahead and do that now. Pause the video, and when you're done, come on back and we'll tackle it together. Okay, so I'm assuming that you're back. Let's jump right into Visual Studio and create a new project. We're going to create a WPF application, .NET Core. And we'll select Next. And we'll call this the WPF Mini Project and WPF Mini Project App. We're going to hit Create. And just like with the WinForm project, because I'm going to do something very, very similar, I am going to create a class library to add to this. Now I could, and this is just because it's loading, that's why it says the assembly references are missing, because now they'll show up. I could bring in that DLL from that other project and use that instead of creating another class library that's identical. And I'm debating if I should do that or not. I tell you what, let's do it, because I want to really show you that the power of these class libraries. So instead of creating a new project for our class library, let's right-click on Dependencies and say Add Reference. We're going to Browse. And we're going to hit Browse here, and that's not the right location, so let me find the right location. Let's right-click on here and say Open Folder in File Explorer, and we'll go up one and look for the WinForm mini project, and the output of demo library is in the bin folder debug net standard, and it's empty. We don't have an output here. We'll probably have one in the WinForm project. If we look at debug and release, oh, they're empty as well. So we're going to have to build this project. So let's open this up. And once we do, we can build just the DLL. So I just want to do this to show you that we can reuse these projects. So I'm going to right click on this and say, let's change this to release and say build. And once that's done, we can come over here to demo library, go to bin, release, net standard 2, and now we have demo library.dll as well as a PDB file, which that is how we reference that library. We don't need to have that for this since we already know, we don't have to debug it essentially. And then the JSON file for dependencies, we don't need that. So we just need this DLL. Let's copy this path and then come over here to, we can also get rid of this. We don't need this WinForm project. I'll move it off to the side. And I'm going to right click on dependencies, add reference. Under browse, I'm going to paste in my path and select demo library and hit OK. Now what that has done is it's brought that DLL in just like I would have if it was an actual project. Let me show that off. So if I come over here and I create a new instance of that class, let's call the person model class. So let's create a list, a binding list, binding list, control dot, to add the using statement, a binding list of the person model. Oops, no, address model. That's the list we're going to show. So address model. And I control dot here. I can add a using statement for demo library. And now it has a reference to that. And if I hit F12 on address model, we can see there's the address model from my metadata. So it says street address, city, state, zip code, and address display value. Now it doesn't show the actual code. It just shows the properties I have access to. So this one is a read-only property, so it's just a getter. It doesn't show the lambda expression and what it does. So now I can say addresses equals new binding list of address model. I'm going to bind this to a list box we don't have yet. So let's design our front end. And let's keep a similar look to what we had in our WinForm project. So let's make this a little bigger. We're going to apply the font size of 22 by default. And now let's create our grid layout. So grid dot column definitions. And our column definition is going to be the width of auto, like so. And now how many columns do you want? Well, I think we want is, I liked that centering we can do on a form. So let's create one at the beginning that's of type star, and one at the end that's of type star. But then in the middle, let's create two that are of type auto. That way we can have our labels and our text boxes next to each other, but at the same time have that same separation between them. You see, if we did stack panels with a horizontal alignment for first name and the same stack panel for last name, the spacing between the first name label and the text box would be the same width, but it might be a little bit off from last name, because last name is a little shorter than first name. And so our boxes wouldn't quite align right. But if we have two columns, we can put our labels in one column and our text boxes in another column and line them up exactly. So I think that's what we're going to do. And now let's create some rows. Grid.row definition. And I'm going to have, let me bring this on a screen real quick. I minimized it, but let's bring it back to the screen. This is our design. Now, typically when you're building an application, the first thing I always recommend is that you draw it out on paper. Don't put it in code, draw it on paper. And the reason why is because it provides with you an easy to change design. And once you have it designed the way you want it, then you can just take that design and put it into, in this case, XAML. Well, this is representing, our WinForm project is representing that design, the final design we've drawn out, because we've already built this once, but now we're building it again in a different user interface. So you already have a basic idea of what a desktop application should look like. So let's just take this design just as it is and try and implement it in WPF. So for rows, we have a row for first name, one for last name, that's 2, 3, 4, this address is an add, 5 for our list box, and 6 for our save button. So we need at least 6 rows and 1 extra for our star at the end. So let's do that. So 7 total rows. So row definition, and the height is going to be auto. And we need this, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the 7th will be star. Okay, so now we have the row definitions we need. Now we can start laying things out on this form. Now, if you want to put a comment in code, you can do that with a exclamation point and dash dash, like so. This is now a comment, so you could say things like row 0. And you could break things up by rows or breaking things up by logical piece or whatever you want to do. but that way it allows you to have those comments where needed. All right, so let's start with our text block for first name. So it's going to say text block, and the grid.row is going to be row 0, and the grid.column is going to be column 1. Because remember, column 0 is that star column. And the text block is simply going to say first name. That's what appears right up here. And then we're going to have a text box. And that's going to be on grid. Let's give a name first. And that name is going to be first name text. Notice I didn't have to give a name to my text block, and I didn't. There's no reason to. I don't need to give it a name unless I need to reference it somewhere. So first name text, and grid.row is going to be still row 0, but the grid.column is column 2. And we're going to have a minimum width of 200. And do we need a maximum width? Let's put a maximum width of the 300 like before. And I think that's all we need. Oh, I know what else we're going to need. We're going to need some type of margins and paddings here. So let's figure out how we want to create our margins. Let's first put a margin on first name so that we move it down from the top. So margin, we can start off at 0 and then put 20 for the top and 0 and 0. That moves it down. Notice the text box is much larger. It actually takes up the entire height of our cell. Not exactly what we're looking for because we want to move that down as well. So let's first of all put some margin next to our first name, margin of, let's say 5. Give it a little bit of space there. That looks good. And now we need to give a margin on our text box. And that margin should be 0 to the left, 20 on top, 0 to the right, and 0 on bottom. And now we have it lined up a little more like what we want. Now we have our first name. We can copy these two sections, or 2 items, and paste them. It's going to yell at me for this. We can change the last name and change this to say last name. But notice it's really weird. It's over in the same section. That's because they're on the same row as the previous grouping. So change this to row 1 and row 1. And that's better, but we've got way too much space between the last name and box and the thing above it. So let's change our margins here to be 10 and 10. And that looks better. So now you have first name, last name. Let's do it again. Only this is going to be on row 2. And it's not going to be a text box. So let's do this. Let's comment this out. Notice I use my commenting button to comment it out. And it shouldn't be last name. It should be active. And we need a checkbox. Well, what's the checkbox in WPF? It's probably just checkbox. And this is going to be the active checkbox. That sounds good. And let's see if that's all we need besides where we're going to place it, which is grid row, grid column. And that's probably all we need. Oh, we're going to need margins. So let's grab the same margins. And we'll close this out like so. And now we have a checkbox on our form. Is it pretty? No, not really. So let's go to our properties and look and see if we have a vertical alignment. Let's align that at the center. and that kind of moves it more towards what we want. And now we have a center aligned. Okay, so now this is looking good. The only thing I don't like is the fact that active is way over here on the left versus first name and last name. What if we tweak this a little bit by saying horizontal alignment is right? Check that out. It's right next to our checkbox now. And our checkbox, maybe we can try bottom. Just see what it looks like. Too far. So back to center. Okay, so now we've got our horizontal alignment on our text box for active to be right. Let's add that to the other ones as well, so it will adjust them slightly probably. Oops, not the text box. The text block. And the same thing for the first name. And so with that, we now have a much better aligned form. We can put more space if we want to between them, but I think that's good. So now you have first name, last name, and active. We can go with our next, which I'm going to copy the one up here since it's more in line with what we're doing. I'll delete this comment and paste in this. So now this is on row 3. And this is on row 3, but instead of a text box, it's going to be a button, and it's going to be the add button, add address, and we're going to say min and max width. Nope, that goes away, but we do need to have some content in here. So this is going to be add, like so. Then it says add, name add was not found. Let's wipe this out. I think it's an editor problem. Add address. There we go. Yep, it was an editor problem. So the editor is still a bit quirky at times. We want to say over here, this is going to be addresses. And our button, we don't want to take up the entire space. We want it to take up quite a bit less space than that. And we want it to be right aligned. So let's actually give it a width. So a width of, let's see what 50 looks like. That looks about right. And then we also want to say that the horizontal alignment is right. So it puts that button over there to the right. So with that, we now have our structure. We can add the final thing, which is our list box. But before I do that, I think we need to move these two things down a little bit. We did on our previous form. So let's move these down by assigning the top margin to be 20. And see what that looks like. I think that looks better. It kind of gives it a little more space between these first three and this one down here. Now we can add in our grid. And that's going to be a list box, not a grid, sorry, list box. And our list box is going to have a name of addresses list. And now we need to give it a grid.row. Well, grid.row is easy. That's 4. But what's the column? If we say grid.column is column 1, then it's only going to be the width of this column here. What we really want is the width of both of these columns. And that's where the idea of grid.column span comes in. We're going to span 2 columns. And now we can also give it a margin. Let's do that. So a margin is going to be 0 on the left. The top, let's do very little on the top. Let's just do 5. So that address and the add button sit right on top of it. and then 0 on the right, and let's do 0 on the bottom as well. Like so. And now we have our list box. And it's very, very tiny because, of course, there's nothing in it right now. Now we can define the item template. Whoops, that's the list box item template. And then inside there, we have our data template. Now this one is a little interesting because we don't just want one item, we actually have a complete address. And how are we going to display this address? Now remember that this is WPF and we can design any type of thing inside of this per item. So I'm going to decide that I want 2 rows per item. I want the first row to be the street address, and I want it to be a bigger font, something a little bit more bold. And underneath, in a smaller font, I want city, state, and zip. So let's do that. Let's set up a stack panel. And the orientation is going to be vertical. And inside of here, I want 2 things. The first thing I want is a text block. And that text block is going to have a text equal to binding. And that binding is going to be on a certain property of our model. And that's the street address. I'm going to say path equals street address. Now, how do I know that's what that is? Well, this is going to be bound to a list of address model, which the address model has street address as one of the properties, also city, state, and zip code. I'm not going to use this address display value. That doesn't mean anything to me. So instead, I'm going to have my binding here. Now, it says invalid markup. That's because I didn't finish this text block, and so it can't render this until you finish it correctly. So if I finish this now it's back. So I have a stack panel that's vertical, and I have one thing in it, my street address. Now I'm going to leave that as the font size for street address, which means I'll shrink the font of city, state, and zip. So my next thing in my stack panel is another stack panel. And this one's going to have an orientation of horizontal. So these things on the second row will be horizontally aligned together. So I'm going to say that I want a text block that has a text of binding, path equals, and this is going to be the city. And I want to see the font size. Let's put the font size at something really a lot smaller. Let's say 12. We'll see how that looks. We can always modify it later. So the font size of 12 for city. Like so. And then I want to do that a few more times, one for state and one for zip code. State and zip code. However, I don't want to mash these 3 things together quite that close. For example, I want city, comma, space, state, space, space, zip code. How do I do that? More text blocks. Only this one, the text block, the text is going to be comma space. And this next one is going to be just space, space. Okay? And that will be our address. So street address up top, and then in smaller font, city, state, and zip code. That's the layout that I want to see on my form. Now, we're not quite done yet. Notice we can collapse this so it doesn't take up as much room on our XAML page. We still have the Save button down below. So I have one more thing, a button with a name of Save Person. And this is going to be on grid row 5. And again, grid.column of 1, but grid.column span of 2. I'm going to set the margin equal to, let's go with 0 on the left and right, and I want to have, let's make sure it's got enough space, so 20 on top and bottom. I'll leave it just like that. I'm going to set the width, I think, on this, but we'll see. So we're going to close this out and say this is the Save button. And that might be okay. That might look just fine just the way it is. Maybe I'll put some margins on the left and right as well. Let's see what 20 all around looks like. That might be pretty good. And then we'll set some padding. Left and right is fine, but the top and bottom needs some work. So let's do 10. We have a nice big bold Save button. And now with that being done, we have this form that looks basically like the other form. It's just that list box hasn't grown yet to the size it needs to be, and so that will change. Okay. Next, what we need to do is actually start wiring these things up. And that's going to, let's start with just putting in some temporary information into addresses and see what happens. See if it looks right. So we have our addresses list dot item source equals addresses. And we need to insert a new address into addresses. So addresses dot add new address model. Let's say that our street address is going to be 123 Wallaby Way, and the city is going to be Clark Summit. The state, let's scroll up a little bit here. The state equals PA, and the zip code equals 18411. Now we have at least one address in here. Let's run this and see how this form looks when it's running. Okay, it's popped up, and here is here is our layout. It looks ugly, don't it? I mean, it's kind of cool in the fact that, you know, we've got this really bold 123 Wallaby Way, and then in smaller type we have Clark Summit PA 18411. But first of all, the spacing here is huge, and why is this comma way down here? Well, that's because we didn't change the font size on those two items. So let's do this. Let's keep this here. Let's move over our designer, go back to here and use the hot reload functionality to look for our item template. And we're going to change our font size. So font size for our comma and font size for our space as well. And now things look more like they should. Let's drag this out and bring that back. So now that comma is much more in line with what it should be. That spacing is a little better, and our list looks pretty cool. Okay, obviously there's only one thing in it, but it's a lot more stylistically pleasing than the list box on the WinForm page. And it wasn't much more work. We just set up the template we wanted and then applied that template for every single row, which in this case is one row. Okay, now let's do it right. So we'll get rid of that. And the first thing we need to add is a new form. So add a new window, it's called. And this is going to be our address entry. And we'll set the font size to be 22 like before. And we really want a lot of the same things we have on this page over here. So let's do this. Let's scroll to the top. In fact, let's get a lot more space here. Let's scroll to the top and grab our column definitions and row definitions. And you may ask, what happens if you have too many rows? And the answer is, who cares? Because they're auto, they collapse down. So we can have 20 rows. If we only use 2, no big deal, unless they were stars for some reason. Okay, I'm going to paste this in here, and now I have a grid definition that matches my first page, where I have 2 columns in the middle. And I'm going to want to, again, follow the same pattern. Let's close that one out. And I'm going to follow the same pattern that we have up here with first name and last name. So I'm going to grab these 2 right here, and I'm going to paste them over here. And now I have first name and last name, but that's not quite right. Instead, we want to have street address. And we want to have city. And this should be city text. And this should be street address text. And it's yelling at me because it says the name first name text was not found, but it's not there anymore. It just needs a rebuild and it'll be fine. Again, that's the quirk of the editor. See, there we go. Rebuild helped that. Okay, so street address and city. I'm going to need 2 more for state and zip code. So let's just, again, copy and paste these things down below. And this is going to be state text, and this one is going to be zip code text, and this will be zip code, and this will be state, like so. And we do need to change the rows. So it should be row 2, this should be row 2, and this should be row 3. And row 3. And now we have our form pretty much like we had it on the previous, on the WinForm project. But we're missing something. We're missing that big header at the top where, it said address entry. So how do we get that inserted? So there's a little drop down over here. So if I mouse over my grid, I'm selecting my grid right now. If I mouse over my grid and say this little drop down and say add row before, it added a row. Now it said that row the height was 80. Let's not make it 80, let's make it auto. But now notice that text block is in row 1, not row 0, which means I can say text block in grid.row0 and grid.column1 and grid.column span of 2. And let's do it like that for now. And we will say this is the address entry form, like so. And notice it's now above my address entry. But I want it to be bigger. So let's make it a font size of, I don't know, what does 38 look like? That seems about right. Now let's also make it centered. So horizontal alignment of center. Done. Do we need to have some margins at the top? Probably. So let's add a margin. Left for 0 for the left. Top, we're going to have 20. Right and bottom of 0. Is that too much? No, I think that's fine. I think that's just fine. So now we have our address entry form all designed except for the button at the bottom, which looks, again, very familiar compared to this save button. So we'll click on it. I'm going to copy this. I come back over here, paste it in, and instead of save person, it's going to be save address. And this is on row 5, notice, which actually we're on row 4, so it's perfect. But if it's row 6, no big deal. It would collapse the row 5 down to nothing. It wouldn't have to be necessarily directly in sequence, but I think this is good the way it is. So we now have an address form rather quickly because we copy and paste all these different designs over, and it lines up really nicely. Again, we need to rebuild in order to clear that one kind of bug in the editor. So, and it's still yelling at us, but it says save person was not found. It's still, let's do a rebuild. That should do it. There we go. It's gone away. Just an editor bug. So street address, city, state, zip code, we now have an address entry form for us. I'm not sure if you noticed, but everything here is actually aligned exactly right. And the reason it's aligned exactly right is because of the fact that we're using these grids. And so that grid system allows us to align things perfectly. Now, city to state, there's a space in there that's weird. And that's because we probably have a margin issue. So let's see, at state, we have a 20 on top instead of normally we have 10 on top. And if we change this as well, now it's perfect. So we don't have to drag things around and kind of eyeball it and make sure it's right and miss it by a pixel or two or use tools for alignment. We can just use the grid and say center, left, and right, and we know that things will align on those axes. So now everything's aligned right down the center, and we have our labels next to our boxes, and they're exactly the same width from the boxes for each one of them. And our address entry is centered, and so is save. And so we're now, just in a line. It's perfect. Okay, enough talk about the nice UI and how it looks. Let's actually get this to work. Let's go to the code behind for address entry. And this is going to look a lot like the code behind for the win form. We're going to first capture an isave address, which control dot to add our using statement, and we'll call it parent. And we'll pass in an isave address into our constructor. And we're going to put the parent into parent so we can use it long term. And now we need that click event for the save button. So I can double click on it, or I can just say, give me a click event and create a new event handler, which it did for me. And now that's right here. And so I'm going to say address model, address equals new address model. The street address equals street address text dot text. The city equals city text dot text. The state equals state text dot text. Notice how my naming conventions really help me out here. If I'm looking for a state, I can just start typing S or ST, and I can find the state right away. I don't have to look for text box 45 and see, oh, no, that's 46 that I want. Makes it a lot easier. Zip code equals zip code text dot text. So that creates my model, and then I can just say parent dot save address. Now, do I know who's calling me yet? Nope, don't care. I just know that whoever's calling me is implementing isave address, and that's where I save my address back to. And this dot close manually closes a window. Okay, just like it does in WinForms. So that's all my code. That's all my code for the address form. The address form is all done. And now I can come back over to my main form, and let's talk through this button here. So let's create a click event for this. So that's done. And now down here we have our click event. So for that, we need to create a new class, which would be address entry equals new address entry. But remember, it's yelling at us, and it says you need to pass in an instance of an iSave address. I'm going to pass in this, but this isn't an instance of iSave address yet. Don't worry. iSave address, control dot to implement that interface. And we have to actually put some code here, so let's actually do our save. So addresses dot add address. That's our save method. And then down here, we can just do a entry dot show. Okay? So now we have the ability to do our say or add to our addresses. Since we're already here and since we've done this once already, let's go ahead and wire up our save button as well. We'll just do it all in one shot. So click equals and save person underscore click. And remember that the save person, we didn't actually do anything with it except for create that person model. So person model, person equals new person model. First name equals first name text dot text. Last name equals last name text dot text. The is active equals the is active dot, oops, not is active. What do we call it on our form? I think we call it something a little bit different than last time. We called it the active checkbox. Okay, it's a little bit different. Active checkbox dot checked is checked. So it's again a little bit different than WinForms. But also notice it's going to return back a bool question mark. Well, what is a bool question mark? A bool question mark is a nullable Boolean, meaning it can have three states. It can be true, it can be false, or it can be null. And if we try to assign it to a Boolean that's not nullable, we have a problem. Because, yes, our Boolean will accept true and false, but it does not accept null. So what do we do here? Well, we're going to use a new type that we haven't discussed yet, I don't believe. And that is, we're going to put in parens, and we're going to say double question mark, which is the null coalescing operator. And what that says is, if the first thing is null, then do the next thing instead. In this case, I'm going to pass in false. So if this is true or false, just put that value into is active. But if it's null, that's what the question marks are checking. If it's null, don't put this value there, put this value there. So if it's null, it's not checked. Therefore, it is false. So that's how I'm going to handle that. And then finally, we have our addresses, which equals our addresses dot to list. Put a semicolon at the end of that. We can put our breakpoint here to read those values and make sure it's still working the way we expect it to, or this one's working the way we expect it to. It's the same, pretty much the same code as in our WinForms with just minor modifications for, is checked versus checked and the null coalescing operator. Couple of tweaks, but that's about it. Let's run this and see if the application works as expected. So we'll bring it over the form, and we now have, let's go Tim, Corey, yep, I'm active. I'm going to add a record, and that pops up the form here. I'm going to say 132 West Main Street. Notice my form got a little bigger as I typed. Scranton, PA 18871. Add that. Let's add to the list. Let's add another one. And this one's going to be 2 West Broadway. I don't know why I have West on the mind. And this is going to be in, I don't know, Pomona? California? I have no clue. Let's just do that. So now I have 2 entries, and again, really nice styling, or at least a level above what you'd see in WinForms. And now I can hit save. We hit save, we can go to our locals window and look at the person object. We can see Tim Corey, active is true, and the addresses, there's 2 of them, and the second one is 2 West Broadway, and the first one is 132 West Main Street. So it has all the information we need, just like our WinForm application. It's just that it's visually more appealing. Okay, so with that, we are done with our homework. We've built the application that we set out to. It has a lot of similarities to WinForms, but there's definitely some differences as well. Let's now look at our pro tip for today, which is WPF is designed for data binding. And that's what we did with that list box. We can do so much more with it. You can treat it like WinForms, but don't. And that's everything from how it lays out to how you're doing the binding even. Make sure that you treat it like its own thing, not just try and take the things you know in WinForms and apply them directly to WPF. See how WPF wants to do these things and make sure you do it that way so you can have things like text boxes that grow and shrink as needed, and list boxes that grow and shrink as needed, and things that are aligned correctly because of the grid, not because you put in the correct pixel numbers for each of them. Okay? So hopefully you grasped what we did in this WPF demo. Hopefully you got something similar when you built it, and if not, try and go back and do it the way I did it and just practice. The more you practice these things, the more it's going to start to click. And if you're not quite getting it yet, or if you're kind of lost a little bit, don't worry. Just practice. The more you practice, the better off you'll be. Don't just keep watching more and more videos thinking, well, I'll finally get it eventually. And you may. It's much easier, though, if you watch the same video over and over again, and if you build the applications. Don't just rely on me to show you. Do it yourself. Okay? Once you have, once you feel comfortable with WPF, at least in this level, then go ahead and move on to the next lesson in this module.